Hello and welcome to Money, Me and COVID-19, where we meet with business and investment leaders to understand the full impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. My guest today is a hugely successful entrepreneur. He left school at 15, built up one of the country's biggest accounting practices, and then sold it for more than £80 million. His autobiography is called How to Make Millions Without a Degree. And these days, he makes lots of investments in startup businesses, much of it done on the Twitter platform. So he's become known as the Twitter Dragon. He's also a very successful racing driver. He's won his class in the Le Mans 24-hour race and won the European Le Mans Championship. But perhaps most relevant for us today is that he's the one who's mounting a legal challenge against the government's lockdown program. His name is Simon Dolan. Simon, welcome to the program.
Hi, Graham. Nice to see you.
Well, before we talk about the legal challenge itself, just tell me about some of the businesses that you still own and what the kind of impact of lockdown has been on them.
It varies, really. So my businesses range for all sorts of different things. So there's no particular common thread, and it literally runs from aviation all the way through the alphabet, pretty much to women's tights at the other end. And evidently they're affected in different ways, so aviation has been really hit hard for all the reasons that you see. We're not like Virgin and sell seats. For example, we ferry the football teams around. So 8 or 9 Premiership football clubs use us to get to their matches and so on. Well, evidently football's been cancelled, so they're not going anywhere. So with planes, they're really expensive things to be sat on the ground doing nothing. So that's been badly affected. Other things, more or less, it just depends on how well the businesses have been set up and what it is that they do. So software company that I invested in, it's kind of all right. It's getting by. My worry is not so much the immediate impact of this. It's going to be 12 months down the line or 18 months down the line. I think that's what people are not really realising. If you had me on here in 2 years' time, it might be a different story.
Well, yes. I think just today I've seen that the first quarter figures have been announced, which have only taken into account 1 week of lockdown. And already, though, that quarter takes us back to the worst one since 2008. Can you imagine what quarter two's figures are going to look like?
I see the same thing. The GDP drop, I think it was 5.8%, which is the biggest drop since they started measuring it. And to put that into pound terms, I think it's 10 or 12 billion pounds of GDP drop. And then when you add to that the 10 or 12 billion pounds that they're spending on furlough, so this is not money that they're putting in loans. This is money that the government are giving you. That's 20 billion a month. And as you say, this was in a fairly tame month of March, April, as you say. You've got to think that the GDP is going to be down 10% for sure.
Yeah, and of course, we don't have a government that's made up of lots of business owners, but I read a recent survey from America of, I think, 6,000 SMEs, where on average they had less than a month's cash in hand. And unless you've ever run a small business, you just don't know what the pressures are. But I suspect there's a lot of British SME businesses that are absolutely teetering on the brink at the moment, and people have no idea that this kind of domino effect is going to start taking thousands of companies just out of existence.
Yeah, and I think it's cash flow that's going to kill it. I don't actually, profitability. Your starting point was that you had a profitable business and you gave people credit, and then the whole virus lockdown thing came, and then all of a sudden most of those people just stopped paying. So landlords is a really good example, but there's thousands of others. And if people stop paying you whilst you're still profitable, you haven't got the cash in the bank. We all know the difference between profit and cash flow. And that cash flow will never, it's never going to come back. And maybe, if businesses are starting to get back on their feet, in 12 months' time, all of these loans that they've been forced to take on by the government shutting them down need to be repaid. And it's all very well saying, well, they're going to be, interest-free for the first year and no capital repayments, and then it's only going to be 2.5% interest at the end of that. You've still got to pay it back. And this is a significant chunk of money that most people are borrowing, which they now have to pay out of businesses that have been decimated, maybe just about got back on their feet, and then have to pay a big lump of loan back for something that really wasn't their fault. And it brings us on to the case, I guess. But I really do believe that what the government have done is illegal. And if it turns out that what the government have done is illegal, that has huge ramifications then going forwards in terms of all these loans that they forced people to take out. It's a wide problem, and it's only getting bigger. The more the government prevaricate, the worse it gets.
Yeah, and I think that there tends to be this sort of almost a competitive locking down in Western governments. When one started doing it, the others wanted to be seen to be doing the same thing, and yet not every country has had to react in this way. So that there is more than one way to deal with this pandemic, and some countries like South Korea and Sweden and so on have taken a different approach and seem to have actually come out of it with better statistics than Britain. So one of the things that galls me is this idea that we're somehow following the science and hiding political decisions behind supposed science. What's your take on how this government has reacted versus the way some other countries?
First of all, I think all governments have been in a very difficult situation. And I think almost whatever they did, they were going to get hammered. And what's interesting is it's not even really a right or left thing. Most political things, you're either right wing or you're left wing. That doesn't even seem to be. In fact, I think a lot of the cases have actually been reversed. But yeah, I'm quite firmly of the mind that actually it didn't really matter what governments did. The outcomes seem to be pretty much the same. And indeed, it seems to be an inverse correlation between the severity of lockdown and the amount of people that have died, if we say deaths per million. So you look at Italy and Spain and France and the UK, pretty vigorous lockdowns for all of them, and yet the highest rates of death. Obviously, then you go to Sweden and you say, well, actually, Sweden had no lockdown to speak of. They were just a bit sensible. And they've had, relatively speaking, lower deaths. But then you compare Sweden to Denmark and Norway, and they had even fewer deaths, but they did have lockdown. I'm not so sure that there's actually anything that anybody did that made any difference whatsoever. And when, truth be told, when you look at all the charts and the graphs, those curves, they all end up pretty much the same. Mm. So I think it's probably got far more to do with where you live, how much you weigh, what pre-existing conditions you've got, how old you are, whether you see the sunlight, or you're in, you've been through a winter, for example, in England where there's not been much sun. In the Côte d'Azur, I live in Monaco, and there's been barely any cases at all in the entire Côte d'Azur. Well, it's really sunny here, so maybe there's a link between that and vitamin D. And I think it's a little bit like the weather, there's a million, probably more than that, different factors involved in this. And humans are very arrogant and think that the actions that they take actually have some sort of an outcome. And it's a bit like, in the old days where they used to, sacrifice a virgin on a rock to make sure that they got great crops the next year. And then when they got great crops the next year, they said, see, we had to do that. Imagine if we'd not done it.
Yeah.
that's where we're at.
That's obviously the missing strategy that Boris hasn't come up with yet. But what was it? What was it that actually, it's one thing to have this kind of discussion about it, but obviously something must have really kind of got under your skin to drive you to the point of wanting to take this legal action. So what was the chain of events that led up to you, triggering the actual legal challenge?
It was fairly basic, to be honest with you. I'd been mulling it over in my head, just thinking to myself, well, basically it's not right. So you could see that, but then you kind of think, well, what can you do? There's not a huge amount that you can do against the government. And, you can write to your MP or you can protest. Well, not anymore. Maybe you can do a petition or something. So it was just mulling around in my head. And then I happened to read an article by a barrister. And it was in one of the newspapers and I saw it. And he said well, he believes that, there's potential for a judicial review and it was illegal. So I just got in touch with him and said, well, what do you think? And do you fancy it? And that was where it started. And that was only 12, 13 days ago now.
And I think there are 2 or 3 elements to the challenge, aren't there? You want to just talk us through the specific points on which you're making the challenge?
Well, there's three elements to it. The first is a technical legal thing, which is whether they acted ultra vires, I think, which is beyond me. I don't really understand it. I think it means that they're acting outside of the law. But the ones that are more relevant to me are basically what they have done in proportion to the threat. Now, at the time, you could say, well, maybe it was. But now, there isn't an expert in the world anywhere that would agree that what the government is doing is proportional to the actual threat. So that's an interesting one, I think. And then the third one is whether it's basically an infringement of a basic English right, which is the right to enjoy private property peacefully. So they're the three tenets that we're going on.
Okay, and one of the things that when you think of the legal system, you think of a very slow-moving machine, especially at a time like this with courts being cancelled and so on. How time is of the essence here? How quickly can this get to some kind of outcome?
Well, so I was amazed actually because I've been involved in a few cases before, and they just torturous the amount of time they take. But with judicial reviews, and because it's such an important point, it actually happens very quickly. So we'll get a reply from the government to our initial letter. We'll get that tomorrow. So that's, May 14th, which is the maximum amount of time that they had to respond. And they have to reply substantively. So there has to be a complete rebuttal against our case. And then when we see that, digest that, and then we take them to court. And then we take them to court, probably sometime toward the end of May, I guess it will be. We'll have a date, and then that will be when we have the fight. So it actually moves very, very quickly.
Okay, and the fact you've been able to raise over £100,000 suggests that Britain's entrepreneurs are very much behind this, and they want some answers as well.
Yeah, this is interesting. So the whole crowdfunding thing. When I initially spoke to the barrister, it was just going to be me funding it, and that was that. What I was happy to do, I could afford to do it. So. And then the barrister said, somebody else has been in touch, a lady called Erica, and she wants to basically, put some money in and go and sort of be involved. So I spoke to her, and so we agreed both to put some money in. And then the lawyer who's now involved at this stage, he says, if people want to make donations, they can't really make it straight through us because we haven't got the capacity to deal with it. So he said, why don't you set up a crowd justice page? And I'd never heard of that before. Heard of crowdfunding, but not the crowd justice. So we just set it up on just really out of the idea that, if people wanted to join in, they could. And that was that. And then, of course, people started to get behind it. So as of May 12th, we've had 3,500 separate people donate on there. And you say about entrepreneurs, there's been a few big donations on there, but there's an awful lot of them, sort of £5 and £10, and they're the real heartwarming ones. There's various comments on there, but there's some that are saying, look, I really can't afford to do this, but I don't see that we've got any choice. We have to fight back in some way, or I'm on benefits. I'm sorry, I can't afford to put any more in, but I want to feel as though I'm fighting. So it's certainly not business people predominantly. It's more, I hate to use the word, but it's more just ordinary people who just want to get their lives back and fed up with the government telling them what to do. That's
very interesting, because I'm also sensing a bit of kind of lockdown fatigue and a giving up of compliance. So, for example, I live in Weybridge, and some dork in Elmbridge Borough Council decided that one way of enforcing lockdown was to dump 4 great big skips full of rubble to block a car park at a local beauty spot near you by the river. And for the last 5 or 6 weeks, everyone's been very good children. They've not gone near there. Then just this last weekend, I noticed there was a whole line of cars parked on the road where they couldn't get in the car park. And it was almost like people were giving a bit of a V sign to the council saying, look, we've had enough of this. We want to get our lives back. I just wonder if you're catching a bit of zeitgeist here with this challenge.
I think the timing was very good. We probably, if we'd have done it a week earlier, I don't think it would have gained any traction whatsoever, and I probably would have got slated. And even over the course of the campaign, so when I first started it, I used to there was a lot of hate mail coming through, on various media. And then just last 4 or 5 days, I guess, that's kind of all gone away. There's very, very few now. So out of you know, however many messages that we get, hundreds a day, there's maybe 0.5% or something now that are actually saying, you know, the various insults. So there has been a swing. There definitely has been a swing. And now, you know, I think what the government have done by releasing this really vague, it's odd. It's, you know, in one respect, Boris is saying, well, just use common sense and you can go to the park and do this and do that. And just common sense, it's easy. And then on the other side of it, they've issued a 60-page guidance for what should be common sense. And it's so vague, you know, it's so vague as to be nonsensical. But then that's obviously by design, because what the government are then doing is saying, well, you know, there's our guidelines, and then they leave it up to the police. Now, the police, of course, are on a hiding to nothing. So on the one side, they've got their boss saying, you know, you need to make sure people stay 2 meters apart. And then you've got your local copper, most of whom are quite reasonable people, who are having to go up and measure whether people are 2 meters apart. You know, at what point? And of course, you know, you then get the little Hitler types, who last week were probably on radar gun patrol, and now they've got some real power, and they can tell people to stay away from one another, you know. So I do feel sorry for the police, and I think it's an abdication by the government of what they should be doing, which is being decisive and clear.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the challenges here is if you go back to, say, 2008, that was when they let the kind of QE money printing genie out of the bottle, and of course that's never gone back and is now, you know, bigger than ever. Now they've let this kind of lockdown genie out of the bottle. I can't imagine it's going to go back in. I just wonder, you know, when they'll next start resorting to these sort of measures. And, you know, from a kind of almost the human rights aspect of your challenge, this really does, to me, need to be clarified as to under what grounds you can effectively impose martial law and put everyone under house arrest.
This is one of the reasons the case is so important. It's not so much about what's happening now, it's about what potentially it sets a precedent for in the future. Because this bill that they put in, that lasts for 2 years. It doesn't automatically end after 2 years, it lasts for 2 years. So that means if the government win in the judicial review, it means that you can be locked up at any time they wish for no reason whatsoever, at any time within the next 2 years. And we know that once the law's on the books, it's not going off. You know, in 2 years' time, there'll be another reason. What's the bet? There'll be another really bad virus coming from China or somewhere in 2 years' time. That means they have to extend it, just for the public safety, just for the good of everybody.
And if you're a businessman, you know, trying to make, let's say, a multi-million-pound investment to rebuild a business that's been damaged by COVID-19, if you're in the back of your mind, you're thinking they could do this again next year, are you going to make that investment?
Well, it would depend what you're investing in. You know, you've got to be thinking, well, the only things I would invest in now would be some kind of healthcare market. You know, I think healthcare is going to go crazy after this. So there'll be all those things. And then, you know, enabling people to work at home. Yeah, that's been, on the one hand, you know, if we didn't have the internet, then you couldn't work at home. It would be a complete, even more of a disaster than it is. You know, but if we didn't have the internet, we wouldn't be in lockdown anyway, because the ridiculous messaging wouldn't have got around quite so virally. Excuse the pun. So yeah, in terms of investments, you know, there are still good businesses out there, and there will still be good businesses out there. But you know, I certainly wouldn't want to be in hospitality or commercial property. I wouldn't want to be selling my house. You know, I wouldn't want to have any kind of shops or retail or anything like that. You can't see that coming back. I really can't.
No. So from a sort of business owner point of view, is there any advice you could offer to people who are, you know, wondering how to deal with the next few months and how to you know, get their business through this from what you're doing with your other companies? Is there any advice you could offer for, you know, COVID-19 survival tactics?
Well, I mean, it's cutting everything. It's just the simple stuff, but cutting everything down to the bone. You know, there's no. You just can't keep people on out of sympathy or some sense of duty, or you can, but eventually the money runs out, and then of course no one's got a job. So that's the sad reality and the sad truth of that. You know, negotiate the hell out of everything if you've got any kind of premises costs, which I'm sure people are already doing. And then just investigating how the technology can work. You know, how can you work from home? If you have got retail, you know, hopefully you're already online anyway. How do you actually message your customers now. Hopefully you've got a database of people that you can maybe message out to and get out to. And then, how do you, I think he said he's going to be starting opening shops in July or something like that. What does your shop actually look like? In my mind, if you've got a small shop on a high street and customers have got to stay 2 meters apart, how can you, I don't see how you can exist. I really don't. So then really carefully, you have to think about, well, is this a viable business at all? And you have to take a really hard look at it. And if you believe that it isn't, then you've just got to can it and then move on and do something else. Get online, at least use the lockdown time for something that could be useful going forward. But we just have to accept that there's been an enormous change in the way the world works, and it ain't going back.
Okay, so imagine that in a parallel universe somewhere, there's been a snap general election, and Simon Dolan has been elected Prime Minister of Great Britain. What would you do differently to what you're seeing at the moment?
I'd open up immediately. It's very, very difficult to. Well, it's very easy with hindsight to say what they should have done, and I'm sure if I'd been in Boris's position, pressured to death to do some lockdown, just to do something, then I would have done the same thing. Let's face it, I think we all would. But now, you've got to look at it, especially with Ferguson being completely discredited and all the science being discredited. You've got to hold your hands up and go, look, we didn't handle it as best we could, but we're now opening, and we'll do whatever we can to try and keep it going. But to continue with this sort of pseudo-science of, these are our 60 pages of rules about how we can trade and how we can get out and all the rest of it. It's just a nonsense. There's no science behind it. It's a document written by a committee of 50, which indeed it was. And we all know what they say about committees. So, yeah, it takes some leadership. He's got a hard job, but then that's why he's running the country. It's a hard job. It's not all going around and giving these vague speeches and waving your hands and being a bit of a buffoon on television. Sometimes there's hard stuff to do. I'm afraid, it doesn't seem as though he's up for it now.
Okay, and so as we come to the end of our time together, Simon, what are your thoughts on, we hear all sorts of people talking about V-shaped recoveries and U-shaped recoveries. How do you see this panning out over the coming months and years, and in terms of the total impact and how we are actually going to gradually recover from it?
Well, human beings do recover and businesses do recover. The human spirit's pretty tough. I don't think that will be knocked out of everybody, but I really can't see a recovery in the medium term. You've got to think that things have fallen off a cliff, and I would imagine it will just flatline. You've got zombie companies, you've got zombie sole traders now that are going around. People who can just about afford to keep going. But they're not going to be able to offer much in the way of jobs, employment. Wages are going to go down for sure because there's a downward drive on demand, and that will affect. And no one's going to have much money to spend. It's a pretty vicious cycle that they're in. The money that the UK is printing, well, say it needs to be accounted for in some way, even if not repaid. So you've got to look at austerity measures. I would imagine for the next 20 years. I don't know, how the austerity measures that they put in so far, I think, have gone on for 12 years. And they've blown the entire savings in the last 2 months. That says how big this is. And so I think it would be, I don't know if there's a shape for it, but I just see it flatlining. You'd think Japan, I guess, but probably worse. Sorry.
It's really difficult because I think we're all natural as entrepreneurs, we're natural optimists, but it's really the one sign of the one kind of spark of optimism maybe to take away is that in recessions there's plenty of people that make money, and in boom times there's plenty of people that go bankrupt. So it's never a good time to start a business, and it's never really a bad time to start a business. It's just the time that you have. So, make the best of what you have. And, this is what we have at the moment, so we make the best of it. And I guarantee people will make millions out of this. It's just been different markets maybe than what we're used to, in different sectors. So there is optimism. It's just change. It's the old "Who Moved My Cheese" thing in it, which I'm sure everybody has read. That's one of those big moments.
There's a lot of people there with their trainers over their shoulders at the moment, staring at the wall, going, "Well, it used to be here. It used to be here."
Okay, well, a hint of optimism to end on there. So, Simon Dolan, thanks for joining us from Monaco today, and all the best with your legal challenge.
Thank you very much, Graham. Thank you.